My name is Yankee Tennyson and I'm an Australian Tibetan. I was born in Dharamsala, the seat of the Tibetan administration, and I have lived here in Australia since I was 6 years old. Firstly, we'd like to thank all the ATC's supporters and all those who submitted questions to be asked here today. Before we begin the questions, we'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that we are meeting on, the Ngunnawal people, and recognise that their people and their families have connections to the land and this region. We wish to acknowledge the contributions they make to this city and this region. A quick introduction to Sikyong Penpa Tsering. He is a leading figure in Tibetan politics. Honourable Penpa Tsering is the president of the Tibetan government in exile and was a member of the Tibetan parliament in exile for 20 years, serving his last 2 terms as speaker. He also served as a representative of the Dalai Lama and the Central Tibetan administration to North America. And in his role as the president, Sikyong Penpa Tsering has emphasized the importance of seeking a peaceful resolution to the Tibet issue. Sikyong Penpa Tsering, welcome to Australia. It's very nice to have you back here and to have this opportunity to speak with you on behalf of Australia Tibet Council.
Thank you.
Can I please ask, how are you and what is the purpose of this visit?
As Sikyong of the Central Tibetan administration, we have to reach out to the Chinese government to resolve the Sino-Tibet conflict. Until such a resolution is found, we have to reach out to the international community as much as we can. So that is why we travel to North America, to Europe, to Japan, to now this time to Australia. So all of us know that we can reach out only to the free world. The rest of the authoritarian regimes does not respond to the call of the Tibetans. So we have to reach out to the free world as much as possible. And Australia is becoming a central figure in the new coalitions that are being formed in the form of Quad or AUKUS. And in the times to come, I think Australia as a middle power will have a lot of role to play in bringing all the like-minded countries together against China's assertiveness and hegemonistic intentions in the region. And that has a direct bearing on the Australians as well. So therefore, it's very important that we reach out to as many countries. That is the reason why I'm here, and also to see how responsive is the Australian government to the calls of the people who are suffering under authoritarian regimes.
And how important is resolving the Sino-Tibet conflict to the prospect of a more peaceful world?
We believe that through the middle way policy proposed by His Holiness, supported by a large number of Tibetans, and then unanimously adopted by the Tibetan Parliament, is the best means to resolve the Sino-Tibet conflict. And if this conflict can be resolved in a peaceful, non-violent, mutually beneficial, and a lasting solution for Tibet, then we believe that the border, which used to be Indo-Tibetan border, now after the occupation of Tibet by the Chinese, which has become a Sino-Indian border, we believe that the border issue can also be resolved if the Sino-Tibet conflict is resolved. So that will bring in a lot more stability and security in the whole region. The current political alliances in the region is that China has been supporting Pakistan for a very long time to make sure that India does not grow and uses its influence internationally. Now, if the Sino-Tibet or the Sino-Indian border or the India-Tibetan border is resolved, then there could be better relations between the two most populous nations in the world. Historically, we have played the role of a buffer because of the size of Tibet, 2.5 million square kilometers. There was never ever a war between India and China before China's occupation of Tibet. Only after the occupation, there was the first war between India and China in 1962. And even as recent as the last 2-3 years, China's belligerence on the Indian border is also contributing to more friction between the two most populous nations. India has also taken a very strong position that unless there is disengagement from all the quarters where China has intruded on the Indian border, there won't be normalization of relationships. So that remains a pricking point between the Indians and the Chinese. And I'm sure we believe that this will have a definite influence in the whole region that will also have its impact on Indochina and the larger security issues in the region.
Thank you. How is the Tibetan diaspora community building and maintaining democracy in exile?
Now, this is a gift that His Holiness has given us. And His Holiness, I always say, is a true democrat. And he introduced democracy not even 1 year after coming into exile. He said we should have a democratic polity and representative government. So His Holiness landed on Indian soil on 31st March 1959, and he spoke to the Tibetans on 3rd February 1960 about having a democratic polity. And 7 months after that, we had our first parliament on 2nd September 1960. Even today, we celebrate 2nd September as Democracy Day. So since then, those days, Tibetans had no idea of what democracy meant and what are the democratic institutions or checks and balances and division of labor between the three pillars of democracy, the autonomous institutions, and all that. So His Holiness was very, very persistent and insistent on this. And first 30 years, it was a very difficult period. We had to face a lot of challenges, people having to learn what democracy meant. And then the Tibetan diaspora community also got distributed all over India, from northeast to west to north to south. There were very few Tibetans who were sent to Europe those days, mostly children for adoption. So there were not many Tibetans outside India, Nepal, and Bhutan. First 30 years was difficult, but His Holiness faced all those challenges and decided to move ahead. And then His Holiness said we should have more changes. And then he dissolved both the parliament and the cabinet in 1990. And the special meeting that was held at that time with participation of more than 300 people representing people from all walks of life in the exile community, and also views from Tibetans inside Tibet. Since then, we had a meaningful legislative body, and we also adopted what we practice now, the Charter or the Constitution for the Tibetans in exile. And 10 years after that, again, His Holiness said, I'm not going to live forever. So we should have more changes. And in 2001, we had the direct election of the political leader, or Kalantriba at that time, who is the head of the cabinet. And Professor Samdang Rinpoche was elected. Then 10 years down the line, then His Holiness decided that he should devolve all his administrative and political responsibilities. So since 2011, my predecessor, Dr. Lobsang, took over for 10 years, and now this is my first term. So Tibetans in diaspora are getting more dispersed from India, Nepal, Bhutan, from the compact communities, and moving to different countries. So as of now, we are only about 130,000 Tibetans in exile, with about 72,000 in India, a little more than 10,000 in Nepal, about 1,000 in Bhutan, and the rest of 50,000 in the rest of the world, from North America to Europe to Australasia and other countries. So even though we are physically getting distant from each other, elections are held in one day all over the world. Tibetans are now much more enthusiastic in participation in electoral politics. And of course, democracy and election also means it is divisive in nature, because you have to support either one of the one or two or three candidates, whatever the number. But then people also have to learn that once the election is over, then the responsibility, the onus of running the government or the administration lies with the people or person who is elected. So all these things are sinking in people's mind, and people are also becoming more aware of our democratic processes, because since 2003-4, the parliamentary proceedings are also relayed live through Tibet Online TV, so people can see for themselves as to what their elected leaders are saying and deciding on their behalf. So it has become quite a vibrant democracy. But then, of course, there are challenges. The challenges in terms of the composition of the parliament, and all those are something that we have to face in future. And the real challenge is whether we would be able to adapt according to the changing social and demographic scenario within the diaspora community, and then make changes in the charter accordingly. If we are not able to do that, then there will be a question about the relevance and legitimacy of the Central Tibetan administration. And another aspect that we always try to focus is to prepare the younger generation of Tibetans to take over the leadership. As every community have this saying, hope for the best, prepare for the worst. So we hope for the best that Sino-Tibet conflict gets resolved and we get to go back to Tibet as soon as possible. But till such a time, even if it takes another 2, 3, 4 decades, we should be prepared to carry forward the movement in future. So reaching out to the younger generations of Tibetans who are now scattered in so many different countries is a must, and we make sure that we meet with the younger generations of Tibetans as much as possible in every place that we go.
And speaking about democracy, what would you like to see the Australian government do to help Tibet?
The Australian government, at the outset, I want to say that we are very thankful to the Australian government for the ongoing immigration programs. So far, I think already about 2,169 Tibetans have reached here through that immigration program. But other than that, the Australian government has not or we have not been able to reach out to the Australian government for support in terms of promoting democracy in the exile diaspora, particularly supporting the institutions and it works in Dharamsala. But then at the same time, Tibetan Australians can take part in all the democratic processes. And you have one member of parliament from the region. So these are it's very similar to other countries. So those are also useful countries, not restricting Tibetan refugees not to take part in exile communities' electoral processes. But it would be nice if Australian government also gives us developmental aid in the form of promoting democracy and education and other welfare activities, the challenges that we face in the diaspora community. But we'll also have to reach out to the Australian government and see how they can help.
Thank you. And just speaking on Tibet, Tibet is frequently named as one of the least free countries in the world, and China has effectively closed off Tibet. What can we do to see Tibet open up? What can China do to open up Tibet?
Unfortunately, over the years, and particularly since President Xi Jinping came in, the attitude of the government towards national minorities or nationalities becoming much more stringent, and all the policies and programs are aimed towards eradication of the identity of the nationalities, whether it be Tibetans or the Uyghurs or the Mongols. And Manchuria, there's hardly any Manchurian people who speak the Manchukuo language. In Mongolia, the population of the Mongolians in Southern Mongolia, as what they want to be called, or what China calls as Inner Mongolia, is only about 16%. The rest are all Chinese and Turks. And now in Uyghur and Tibet also, those things are changing. So now the policies that the government follows are very, very restrictive. Laws are being amended. As all of us know, that laws of the Chinese government are very, very ambiguous. It could be interpreted at many levels by people. If they don't like you, they can just arrest you on any ground. And we also know that China needs more investment in the country, but then also they have amended the counter-espionage law, which makes it very difficult for people. They always have to live in fear whether what you do is in accordance with the law or not, because of the ambiguity in the laws. So if China has to progress, but then we keep hearing the sound bites from President Xi Jinping saying communism has proved that development can take place. Unfortunately, China looks at only material development. They don't understand the aspiration of the people, including the Chinese people, in terms of their aspiration in other fields like protection of their language, practicing their culture, their way of life, and all the basic freedoms that everybody else in the free world take it for granted. None of us exist in the whole of China, and more particularly in the nationality areas, including Tibet. So it is up to the Chinese government. And some months back, someone came to meet me, and he said he got some message from China. And I asked him, what is the message? And he said, Xi Jinping wants to be a benevolent leader. So if that is the case, if Xi Jinping wants to be a benevolent leader, thinking about the welfare of others, then he should change his policies and allow other people to come in to see for themselves as to what's going on. Because with the press club also, it's the same thing. They came out with a number of position paper. In a position paper, they have outlined a number of issues where they feel that they have done a lot. But in reality, it's not there. And sometimes they call Tibet a socialist paradise. If Tibet is a socialist paradise, then why don't you allow other people to see the paradise for themselves instead of saying unbiased people or biased people report this or that? And for the Chinese government, when journalists visit there, they are supposed to write what the Chinese government tells them, and that is the truth for them. But unfortunately, communism is built on foundation of lies. And to cover up one lie, they have to tell another lie, and it goes on and on and on. And that is the state of affairs right now. So if Xi Jinping wants to change China, yeah, he has all the powers. Earlier in the Politburo, you always have to have representatives of the previous presidents to make sure that they are not incarcerated or they don't. Under communism, you never know what's going to happen to former leaders. Now, the trend has changed. All the 7 people in the Politburo are his own people, and he has all the powers. So I also joked saying that if Xi Jinping is really serious about becoming a benevolent leader, then he should change all the policies and lead China in a direction that will be fruitful or useful for the future generations of Tibetans or the Chinese people. So then he could be on his way to Nobel Peace Prize.
Yes, it would affect a lot of people.
Yeah.
So in order to open up Tibet, we need to see changes inside.
Yeah, if the political leadership of China does not take that step, it's very difficult for the international. Of course, the international community has to keep pointing these facts to the Chinese leaders, because Chinese leaders always say, oh, we don't care about international opinion, but it does matter to them. And that's why they always accuse His Holiness of internationalizing the Tibetan cause, or now, of course, they're pointing fingers at me because we are traveling around the world. So that being the case, it should come from inside Tibet or inside China before inevitable implosion happens within China.
The following questions are from supporters. So the first question is from Geraldine. It says, "Hello, Honorable Sikyong. We all wish that His Holiness the Dalai Lama to have a long life, but he will die soon. How do you see the passing affecting the Tibetan diaspora? And will you recognize the Dalai Lama successor named by the CCP? Thank you."
Thank you for the question. This is one of the sensitive questions that concerns the Tibetans. And of course, in the absence of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, there will be a lot of setback for the Tibetan movement as a whole. But this is not going to happen during my time, at least. His Holiness keeps assuring us and reassuring us that he will live for another 2 decades and more, that he will live up to 113 years of age. There are also propitious pre-signs that this Dalai Lama will live for a long time. So, yes, His Holiness, as I mentioned before, is a true democrat and he is a visionary. So he prepared the Tibetan community to take responsibility on their own. That's why we have democracy, we have elected leadership, and all that. Therefore, it's very important for the Tibetans in exile also to keep up with the democratic practices that we have, improve upon it and build upon it, and make sure that we will be able to carry out, as we do now, into the future, the democratic governance and the movement of the Tibetans as a whole. So what is important is that we keep in mind the thinkings, the thoughts of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, pursue those thoughts, because whether the Lama lives long or not, of course, His Holiness is determined to live long, but that also depends on the disciples, like us Tibetans, that we understand his thinkings and follow his thinkings. That will be the biggest offering for His Holiness to live long. And His Holiness says something and we act and do something else, not in accordance with His Holiness thinkings, then even lamas might get discouraged to live long. Then lamas may not live long. So that is also the fact. That's also a fact that we should keep in mind. So I always keep telling our people that we have to understand, listen to what His Holiness is saying on political issues, religious issues, social issues, educational issues. And then this Kashak is fully committed to follow His Holiness in all the spheres of our work in accordance with his wisdom.
The next question is from Annabelle McClure. It says, "Dear Sir, what processes are in place to close down the colonial boarding schools? Will it ever be possible? Mind-altering boarding schools do a lot of damage to children. Is Beijing capable of understanding this?"
Unfortunately, Beijing doesn't understand that. And at the same time, we can say they knowingly is doing that. Because when we point out about this fact of colonial-style boarding schools in Tibet, where about 1 million children, Tibetan children between the age of 6 to 8 are in colonial-style boarding schools. Now we've also found that there are another 150,000 Tibetans below the age of 6, between the age of 3 to 6. So they are lowering the age group to make sure that Tibetans from as early as possible are Sinicized and taught how to respect the party and keep away from their language, culture, and all that. So now it's upon the Chinese leadership. When we point that out to the Chinese, they always point fingers to the Americans and say, how did they treat their native people, or the Canadians with the First Nation people? Even with the Scandinavians, with Sami people, Australia with the Aboriginal people, New Zealand with Maoris. So all these, they know that these countries have committed mistakes, and we know for a fact that everybody is trying to make up for it. Even in Australia, perhaps by the end of this year, we will also witness history by rendering justice to the First Nation people, whether it's the Aboriginals or the Torres Strait Islanders. And if that is done, if the Aboriginals and Torres Strait Islanders are given the voice, or a treaty, or truth-telling. Because truth-telling is very important. We have to accept the facts of the past and recognize our mistakes and then make up for future. But China, knowing and understanding all the things that has taken place around the world, how people were subjected to change their customs, their way of life, and is deliberately doing it to the Tibetans inside Tibet. So this is a deliberate policy of the Chinese government to change every Tibetan into a Chinese, change every Uyghur into a Chinese, or Mongolian into a Chinese. That will be very, very detrimental for the, and consequential for the nationalities. Now, it's incumbent upon the countries who have had such experiences to tell Chinese government, particularly governments like Australia, to tell Chinese government that they are doing these kind of things to make sure that they are making up for the mistakes they did. And China should not repeat such a mistake, because this is crime against humanity. And the Australian government, I understand, have sanctioned several countries who have committed crimes against humanity, and then why should China be the exception? So I think the Australians should press the Australian government to tell the Chinese government, we will also do the same thing, that these practices should be stopped. It is a crime against humanity.
The next question is from Paul Foley. Mr. Sikyong, does your government have any plans for a permanent representative in Australia?
We do have Office of Tibet here. So this was started when His Holiness visited India and Australia in the late 80s and early 90s. So in 1992, His Holiness met with the then Prime Minister Paul Keating, and the Australian government agreed to set up a Tibet Information Office. So we do have a Tibet Information Office here, where the representatives are appointed by Central Tibetan Administration, that represents both Central Tibetan Administration and Office of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. So today we have Mr. Kamasenge as the representative and two other staffs in that office. So it very much exists. It has always been there. Now, what we are looking forward to is more collaboration of work between the Tibet Information Office and Australia Tibet Council and all other organizations that work for the Tibetan cause. So that there has to be a concerted, cooperative effort of all these organizations to make a real impact in Australia.
The next question is similar to one previous. So, welcome to Australia. What do you think the Chinese hope to achieve by removing Tibetan children from their parents and enforcing Chinese education in strictly the Chinese language?
I think there are many ways that Chinese government is looking at to change the perspective of the international community on Tibet. We are talking about all kinds of artificial intelligence that the Chinese government is using to control people in the name of national security and social stability. So amongst the artificial intelligence is also the DNA profiling of the Tibetans, and there were reports about a Chinese scientist having been able to change people's DNA. We don't know why exactly. Of course, the two reasons are always political security, social stability. Perhaps this could also be used to change people, Tibetans' DNA, and maybe another few decades down the line, they can say that there was never ever a Tibetan race. So these things keep happening with the Chinese government. So at one time, we really feared Chinese demographic aggression into Tibet. There is, of course, more and more Chinese moving into Tibetan areas, but not as much as we feared. That may also be because the Chinese population itself is dwindling. So they adopted another way of changing the people. That's why they introduced the boarding schools, where they are taught Chinese communist ideology, respect to the party, and change every Tibetan into a Chinese. That is their main aim, so that there is only one China. That's very unfortunate because the whole world is moving towards multiculturalism, just like in Australia also. Many parts of the world, now you have so many different nationalities living in one area, whereas in China, they want to have only one nation and one culture. It's completely moving away from the international trend. And that does not bode well for the national minorities and people like Tibetans.
This is the last question. The question is from Deborah Brown. I feel so strongly about the Tibetan cause, but I wonder how can I help as an Australian?
You're already a member of the Australian Tibet Council, so I think we need to strengthen Australia Tibet Council. You can encourage your friends and families around you to join or be member of Australia Tibet Council, even if you yourself is not possible to go around and advocate for Tibet. There are people who run the Australian Tibet Council who are doing a very good job over the years. Many people have worked on this organization, and today we have Dr. Zoe heading this institution, and she needs a lot more help other than just the Tibetans and the present members of Australian Tibet Council. So if we manage to increase the number of ATC members, that itself will contribute financially to the running of the, so people who have the time and the energy and the expertise to do this kind of job will be enabled to do more than what they are doing now. So at least from the ground up, these are small things that we can do. So build it up to a bigger level. So thank you all very much for your questions, and I really hope that more and more Australians will understand the severity of the situation inside Tibet and contribute towards more advocacy, more awareness on the cause of Tibet. And one particular thing that you can do in your own place is to reach out to your elected representatives, write to the Foreign Office, write to the Foreign Minister, write to the Prime Minister about the plight of the Tibetans on an individual level also. That will accumulate and snowball into a bigger movement. So these are certain things that you can do, and you have been supporting us for a long time. Thank you very much. And for you to understand the cause of Tibet, you have the Australia Tibet Council, who sends you regular newsletters and issues, updating you about what is happening there. And we'll also be very happy about you joining part of the ATC's tour to visit Little Tibet in Dharamsala. So those are very much part of ATC's activities where you can be more involved. And I thank all of you again for your support. And please continue to do so, because the spirit of the Tibetans inside Tibet remains very strong. Even though His Holiness is aging, he still will live for another 2-3 decades. That's why I tell our Chinese friends, let us see whether His Holiness the Dalai Lama outlives the Communist Party or the Communist Party outlives His Holiness the Dalai Lama. So till such a time, it has been 63 long years since we came into exile. We have never lost hope. We will never lose hope. And to keep our spirits alive, your support is also very important. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sikyong Penpa Tsering, and thank you to all the ATC supporters and viewers.